we had a very quiet summer, and Katya and Heller came up and started to look around and say, wow, this is so exciting here in the summer. So we had a bunch of different big ideas that we just didn't know what was going to happen with COVID. So
as opposed to pandemic in New York last summer, which was completely dead.
So,
no pun intended.
Oops. So anyways, we came up with this idea and melded our two programs, ceramics and glass, and came up with an idea to survey the masters of melting from 1970 to present. Katya?
Yes, as we opened our show in New York in June, and we are very pleased to be here today for the official opening, even though this show has been up already also for about a month, for the official opening of the show here at Ferrin. And it has been really such a nice collaboration and also a wonderful opportunity, I think, for a dialogue between the pieces and to sort of see where the touch points are between glass and ceramics and where they diverge. And we are very fortunate to be joined by 6 artists today who all live in the upstate New York and Berkshire region and who work here, and they will be telling us a little about their work.
So one is actually all the way from Philadelphia. So
Oh, sorry.
That'd be Greg Moore. And we wanted to thank our media for bringing us so much attention. I think there's somebody here from Destination Williamstown. Yay, that was great. We've had such support from WANC and First Eagle and Rockaway Report. So I'm not surprised to see a lot of people here, but I'm really happy that you're all here in person.
We also wanted to thank the teams at both galleries, Alex and Becky who are here, and Emma and Lauren who are on the Ferrin team, and my husband and partner Doug Heller, and our team at the gallery, Bob and Seth, who have worked tirelessly to put this together. It has been really a learning curve for us, but it was really great.
We all learned a lot of new tricks from each other.
To do this at a time when everything was just getting going again, and how to work kind of at a distance on really the fine details like inventory and all those things, and also on the bigger picture like the PR. And again, thank you to the press and to everybody who has helped make this a success already.
Great.
So we
have 6 artists, and we wanted to start with City Cash. We have a set of really simple questions that not everyone's going to answer in full, but it's where are you based now? Where were you when you started this body of work? Speak about the origin of your melting process, and speak about the specific work on June. So you're the first to go.
And let's just make sure that we also point out actually what your work is.
There's a piece here, and there's another piece on the back wall on that shelf,
Yeah.
the little shelf.
And can you tell us, Sydney, let's start at
Where are you based
where
now?
are you based
Okay,
now?
currently I'm living in the Hudson Valley in a little town called Marlboro. I moved up there in 1983. I had a sense that I didn't have to be in New York City anymore for my career. And so we moved up, bought a farmhouse with some outbuildings, made them into studios and raised some kids.
And then the next question was, where were you when you started making this work? And maybe it would be good to point out when these pieces were made.
Okay. In the city, I started bending glass in about 1969. I had a studio at 17 White Street in Tribeca, and I knew I wanted to bend glass, and I went to the American Craft Museum, and I said, is there anybody that's bending glass? And there was an English glass bender named Maurice Heaton, and they gave me his number. I called him up. I made an appointment. I spent a day with him. He was kind of a And he taught me what to do. He says, just go back and make the kiln. Here's how you do it. And so that's what I did.
So where in New York was he actually?
He was in maybe Nyack or someplace.
Oh.
He made it out in New York City.
Okay.
He was in the country. That place that I rented in 17 White Street originally had been the home for White Street Glass and Mirror. And that business had been out of business for quite a while, but there was a room almost this big, full of cases of glass that were left over. Great kinds of glass from France, glass from the Art Deco. This was a pink glass that was often mirrored and made into Art Deco architectural elements. And what I learned quickly with that glass is that when I would slump it to a high temperature, the surface reticulated and gave it a frost. And I loved that.
What led you to try to melt it?
I had a business in New York. I started a business in college called Gargoyles. I was making copies of antique wood carvings and stone carvings. And I started that in Detroit, went to New York, had an apartment with a room in the basement of the building, and then had a shop on 6th Avenue between 12th and 13th Street. And one of the things that happened, I started making frames for mirrors and embedding glass in this hydrocal that I was using to cast the objects I was making in. And at some point, I fell in love with a convex mirror. And then I started going to glass vendors in New York City, in Manhattan, and I would buy things that they weren't right, they were overproduced them, nobody wanted it, they'd be sitting around, they were happy to sell me their rejects. And I found on Crosby Street in Soho, there was an Italian glazer who was mirroring glass. And so he would mirror things for me. And I had all this glass in this room, and for good mirrors, what I ended up doing, I bought brand new glass, started melting it over whatever I could think of. And just so it had a little more complex bends in it, and then I would have it mirrored, and it seemed very appropriate to the hippie psychedelic era, because you walk and you see your whole vision move all over. And across the street was a wire company, and at some point I went over there and I started buying nichrome wire, which is like toaster element wire. And it turns out that the coefficient of expansion of that wire is close to the coefficient of expansion of glass. And so this piece here is bent over 16 pieces of very thin nichrome wire. It was a flat piece of glass, and it was heated up till the glass squares started dripping, started moving towards the base. Everything was done by gravity. I didn't make it happen. I set it up to do what gravity and heat.
So Sydney, what year is that?
I think this is the 90s.
90, okay.
Yeah, this was
And the piece in the back?
probably around that too.
Okay.
These were done in my home. They were done in the city.
Okay. So this was revisiting that idea?
Well, when I came up, I brought a lot of glass with me, and I set up my kilns, and that's what I was doing. So it was just a continuation of what was going on in the city.
Okay.
Great. Well, Greg, you're next.
All right.
Greg Moore.
Philadelphia, a university called Arcadia University I teach, and I make work in a studio.
That's the southern part of upstate.
Yeah, well, I went to college and graduate school in upstate.
All right.
That's
Thank
my
you.
spiritual home, so we had it. And so these cups are my contributions to the exhibition. I didn't follow along totally.
Okay. Where were you when you started this body of work?
This body of work in my studio. So the work itself takes place in two locations. The cups were conceived of and partially sourced, the material sourced from a farm in upstate New York called the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture. I make dishes for the restaurant here called Blue Hill Stone Barns. And what you're looking at here are the water cups for the restaurant. So anyway, there's another upstate New York connection. And so I source the material from the restaurant, the material being the bones for bone china, and then I make the work in the studio.
That's great.
And when did you start making these?
2000 and these cups themselves maybe 3 years ago, but the idea for the bone china started in 2015, and then it took a lot of testing and experimenting to see if it was possible.
So can you talk a little bit about that
I
idea?
sure can. So the idea occurred to me actually in the kitchen while having a conversation with the chef, whose name is Dan Barber at the restaurant, about their use of carbonized bone to cook food. So they reuse everything from the farm. Nothing goes to waste, including the bone, which is used, turned into charcoal and then used as a fuel. I took that charcoal back to the studio and fired it in my kiln in an experiment to try to have the charcoal lend some sort of surface patina to a pot that was sitting next to it. That experiment failed, but what happened then was in the sack, or in this vessel where all these carbon black bones had gone in before the firing, sat these brilliantly white bones after the firing, and kind of a useless plate. But the bones then sat in my studio for about a month. Brought them back up to the restaurant, and we started talking about possibilities for those. And then it occurred to me that bone china was made from bones, which is sort of like I should have known. I've been doing this for 25 years. I should have known. But it was an aha moment, and so went back to the studio to try to then convert those calcine or fired bones into a material with which to make pottery. And that took a couple of years of experimentation. Mostly potters, when they make bone china, they open a bag of bone ash and mix it with a few other materials. In the evolution of that material as it developed, I became very interested in how the properties of the animal bone change the qualities of bone china. And at Stone Barns, the animals are raised all organically, only on grass, and animal husbandry techniques are ideal, perfect. That started that idea. I tested that idea with bone china that I made from animals that only ate grass and got lots of exercise, bone china that was made from bone ash from animals that ate grain and maybe were confined as well. And the result of that test led to a funded research grant that my research partner and I got to study the effects of animal husbandry and farming practices on the quality of bone china. I'll make a really long story short to say that there is a direct link between the quality of bone china and how an animal has lived. So much so that we did an atomic analysis of the bone china. I'm really getting in the weeds here. And isolated several.
And this is the short story.
Yeah, several elements that are derived from metabolic bone disease that was only present in the animals that hadn't gotten exercise and ate grain. And all of the animals, with the exception of one in the study, that were only fed grass and roamed free were pure calcium and phosphorus, which is what you'd expect.
And so does that affect the color or other qualities, and how?
Right, so the historical standards of bone china, well, I should say that the recipe I use is the same recipe that Josiah Spode II developed when he perfected the bone china recipe in 1899 in England. So Spode and Wedgwood were in competition. There's some Wedgwood ideas represented. So this is very much Josiah Spode's legacy here. And in fact, if you really kind of hold and look at the material and think about it, this bone china has more in common with the original Spode bone china than it does with contemporary manufactured bone china, because back then cows walked around and ate grass, period. So chemically it was the same as this, and the recipe is the same as this recipe. And yes, so historical standards of bone china quality are measured by strength, translucency, and color. And the exercise and diet of an animal affects all three. So these cups are, the whiteness is shifted toward the blue spectrum. The strength is demonstrably stronger under, so we did all these tests. And then the translucency, if you were to hold one up to the window, is like pretty amazing. So I don't know if you can see that, but if you hold it up to the sun, you can see clear through it. And a lot of that has to do with how thick they're cast. But even, so I sometimes make bowls out of this material that are thicker and you can see clear through it as well. So the relationship between ceramic and glass is evident there. Because actually, chemically, these are more glass than they are ceramic, even though we would consider bone china a ceramic material, because there is some clay. Yeah.
Thanks, Greg.
Wow.
Greg and I and Sarah Margolis Pineo, who is not here today, are working towards an exhibition next year. Greg, do you want to just summarize your thoughts? Or
On the exhibition next year? Yeah. So we're thinking I have several bodies of work and practices. The pottery that I make for the restaurant is very much a part of my studio practice, which includes sculpture and installation as well. For the exhibition proposal here, it's a response to shaker carpentry. That's maybe too narrowly focused, but shaker craftsmanship, that's a trouble there as well. And
some of the objects, some of the beautiful
and the
objects.
So, for instance, I've reinterpreted shaker butter paddles, and let's see what object. Well, that's a set of butter paddles and butter knives in black porcelain, which is a material I use quite a bit. One of my focuses in the body of work for the restaurant is to look at the practices of growing, cooking, and eating bread and butter. And so the idea of the exhibition.
You can imagine what's going to get served in the opening.
Yeah. So I like the idea of a show based around the idea of bread and butter and the objects necessary in the development of those two foods.
And when will the exhibition be?
We're not sure.
Perspiring.
2022. But stay tuned and sign up for the mailing list, and we'll be sure to let you know.
Okay.
I make bread. Yeah. I do make butter churn. We can churn butter.
Can we bring some?
Bread?
Yeah, anybody can bring bread?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you.
So I live in Queens, Long Island City. My studio is in Brooklyn, across the river, Greenpoint. This body of work is actually very much about the very first pieces I ever made in ceramics as a student at the Kansas City Art Institute way back. And it has to do with ideas about color, which we've already been interested in, but also the idiosyncratic phenomenological properties that are unique to ceramics. And ceramics does things well that other materials don't. Other materials do other things well that I've always been interested in things like gravity, reflection, translucency, luminosity. Those are things that ceramics can really take advantage of. And so in 2000, I actually had an opportunity to go to China, and there's a city there, the Imperial Porcelain Center called Jingdezhen, and they do tiles, but very large tiles, up to 8, 12 feet wide, single piece tiles made by hand by 4 feet. They're tremendous. And if you know the blue and white Chinese ceramics and the polychrome ceramics that they do, where they interpret those three-dimensional vessels into large tiles, almost like, very much like paintings. And when I saw those, it triggered an idea that I've been thinking about a while, that ceramic material can do things, particularly compared to paint, thinking about minimal painting, monochrome painting versus the monochromes of the Ming and Qing dynasty, those beautiful reds and blues and yellows. And I was always intrigued by the fact that I thought ceramics was a more beautiful material than paint. And so I thought that there could be a project thinking about sort of a critique, if you will, of a glaze in the sort of monochrome setting, thinking about it as a juxtaposition to things that have been done in paint. And so I did a number of tiles. There's some outside, and they work, but the idea that I was going to stay within this sort of critique of modernism was not going to work. So I ended up developing another project based on these tiles that was about text. And there's a long history, obviously, in contemporary art of text, but also in the history of ceramics. And it begins with the cuneiform tablets, many thousands BC, but also the medieval Persian tiles of Iran. And potters were often commissioned to do these plates that said, let's say, bless this happy home. Well, the potters were illiterate. So oftentimes what they were painting, they didn't really know what they were doing. So the text became many times gibberish. Sometimes it was legible, sometimes it was partially legible. So I started to do a series of pieces that are mostly outside, but this is one of them. This is Braille, binary code, Morse code. This is actually a quote by the art critic Howard Potter, who said that confusion is demanding. And so this was obviously, there's a reference to something that you can see, but there's also an image. So not always are you able to understand what you're seeing, but if not, then there's this image that's hopefully somewhat compelling. Eventually, what I wanted to do was take this whole sort of idea I had about gravity and color and take it into a three-dimensional form. And the reason, a voluminous three-dimensional form, and the reason was flat tile will give you only so much interaction with the fluidity of the glaze, right? And so working with a ground form, the glaze can be stretched, and there's many other things that can be done. So this is actually a nice combination of seeing what the exact same glaze basically does on a flat surface and what it does. And what that developed was a whole interest in the idea of abstraction as it turns, as it refers to the form, as it refers to the surface, going back to a conversation, if you will, about this idea of painting, but now doing it on a different surface. Eventually, this has now led to the most recent work that I'm interested in. This is actually, these are both glazed pieces. This is actually glaze, and the bottom is automotive paint. And I discovered that auto paint has like really wonderful qualities. That when you look at something that's been done in the same material, there's a flatness to it. And this, the auto paint allows for the glaze to really start to jump in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise. And so that idea of bringing different materials, which is what I was starting out with, thinking about paint versus ceramic, has now taken on a life of its own. I'm working with a company that does cast resin. So I'm juxtaposing cast resin pieces with ceramic pieces, colored black in cast resin and colored black in ceramic. These are covered vessels. Doing the same with cast glass, cast in a color red, ceramic in color red in glass. And then finally, thanks to my good friend Raymond, who's going to be speaking next, I've just started to work with a custom auto body painter. You know, those wild cars on the lowriders and all that wonderful stuff. Well, taking in these sort of areas where there's the auto paint, we're going to be taking designs from the history of ceramics, membranes, geometric forms from Neolithic China, and start painting those designs in auto body, very complex, hopefully elaborate auto body surfaces. And there's actually a precedent for it. And if you go back to 16th century Japan, the Oribe pots from the Momoyama period, they did these wonderful pieces where they had these very fluid surfaces covering these very considered drawings of either geometry or naturalistic images. And so this is sort of now going to be an updated version of what the Japanese did back in the 16th century. So,
That's really fantastic. Thank you.
So next up is Raymond Elizabeth, whose work is here in the center. Raymond and I have known each other since my early melting days, when I was working in ceramics and glass and would go to, different
ACC
places.
craft fair,
Yeah, but it was really the WBAI fair where I pulled the money out of my pocket and bought this thing that still sits on my counter today.
Took no commitment.
So Raymond has been inspiring audiences for years. Some of the most explosive moments at conferences you can pin to him. So maybe today he will give us another one, but he's a little older now.
Wiser.
So Raymond, where were you when you started melting?
No, I'm not going to answer your question. I'm going to start from where I want to start. Everyone thinks when they look at a work of art that they can pinpoint a starting point, they can pinpoint a progression in an artist's career, and that's not really true. This work is really a synthesis of years of ideas and feelings. My parents, my father fought in World War II, my mother survived the Nazi occupation in France, and I grew up in a Jewish community filled with Auschwitz survivors or people that left Germany in advance. But all of them had one thing in common: they experienced loss. They lost their past, their culture, their families, their country, and they tried to make a new path in America. So growing up, I was imbued with a sense of decay and loss from my parents. I didn't know it at the time, but it was just there. When I first started my art career with OK Harris Gallery, which Sidney and I were talking about, I showed industrial ruins of American sculptures circa 1890s. The ruins were photorealistic, they were ceramic, and they mimicked wood. They were all decayed. They were all in a sense of abandonment. And I didn't think of it at the time. I thought of it in terms of, I'm making model railroads, which is what I did when I was a child. So I was very successful with that. I moved on to other topics of decay, the loss of the steel mills, changed my materials. I worked with found objects. I worked with rusted steel. I did photography. In the late 80s, my partner in love, Michelin, had come up with a body of work using found wood. And I'd always been interested in technical processes. So I said to her, well, why don't we work with steel and ceramic? Because steel will let you bend in any shape. We can fire it in the kiln with the flesh of the clay. Because steel itself, if you look at a lot of steel sculptures, is very boring. It's flat, it's angular, it's massive. It's not human, it's not tactile. So by using wire clay, actually from the Brooklyn Bridge, by using rebar, we bent and created figures, demons and sirens. We put the clay on there, we painted it, and we had a body of work where I could, verify that putting clay on steel is no big deal. It flakes, it chips. Perfect. I love decay. This is a piece that's mimicking our lives, our bodies. We're all dying, we're all decaying, we're all falling apart. My work is a perfect mirror of that. In fact, if you buy this piece, you get a free tetanus shot to make sure you stay alive a little longer to enjoy life. Okay, so now for the next 10 years, I worked with steel and clay. I did vessels, I did abstract sculptures, and I always liked the idea of a challenge, and I like glass. Glass is almost like the cocaine of the art world. It's glitzy, it's pretty, it seduces you, you fall in love right away, unlike a lot of other métiers. But I didn't know how to blow glass. So one day in Dumbo, we're looking at some glass, and I tell Michelin, well, this is, blown, this is cast glass. And this lady, whose grandmother, they said, no, that's blown glass. How do you know? Well, my son's a glass blower. No kidding. What's his phone number? So I was introduced to Lawrence Silverman. 2013, he's working up at Corning. He's blowing glass as a technician for artists. He was an Alfred graduate. He did not go to an MFA program. He just was in a BFA, started his career. I contacted Lauren, and unlike Sydney, who worries about technical specifications, which Lauren worked about, well, if you blow glass into a metal cage, well, the coefficient of expansion, I said, please, I'm just paying you, just do it. I don't want to know this stuff. I should point out, I'm self-taught. I did not go to a school that taught me what I can't do. I just did it. So with Lauren, basically, we blew glass into these cages. No problem, nothing fractured, nothing cracked. And that allowed me now to have a method of affixing glass to a ceramic sculpture that had steel. So when melting point came about, I'm really working with three materials where fire or heat is part of their natural component. Now I can't say that the glass is melting, but something happened because we like to think we're in control. One of the things I like about my process is the steel sags. Just because it's steel, it doesn't mean it's not going to warp or move in the heat. I've lost pieces because it overfired. So the clay and steel moves. The glass, I built this cage. I'm thinking, oh, all these nice parallel lines would be perfect. Instead, it ended up like a balloon. So it blew past the shape. It added a quality, like Sydney was talking about with his pieces. I had no control about it, but it made it come alive. Okay. The second thing was the technical issue. These pieces of glass come off the piece. There's a peg, so I can fire this piece, I can add these later. But when I come back to the original impetus of my parents, the thing that always strikes me, I have a depressive personality that I try and wipe out. I pretend everything's good, everything's happy, everything's going perfect. But my parents still live in me, okay? And that sense of loss still exists within my soul. So when I started working this work, I began to realize, well, I have the clay, I have the pieces falling off. Collectors flip out, but I say there's future work for conservators in America. So it's really a jobs program that I'm creating here. And then I began to realize that in this identity or struggle with my parents or my history of loss, I never added myself. And I want to be positive. And so I began to view the glass as the flower blooming out of the decay, a positive hope that despite the human condition, the travails, what we all endure, things can happen which are positive. It's maybe minor in terms of what's really going on as we view the world around us, but that became, in my mind, at a late age, the answer of resolving my internal, psychological issues. I'm doing something positive, I can acknowledge decay, I can acknowledge loss, but you still have to persist in the human condition and do something that you can add to a genre, to whatever. So when I look at the work, and this is made upstate to answer one of Leslie's questions, up in the former Borsfeld, which is now the Hasid belt, because they've been buying up the properties and they've been renovating it and creating a new world for themselves. And Lauren, we've worked twice, once at Corning and once at Burton Glass. And I have to say that, I've learned a lot of trades. I've done everything, auto body, painting, construction, but glass blowing, that is the most difficult. You need one person, two people to help. Forget about it. I'm glad I found Lauren. He's been a godsend, and then that's about it. So.
And Raymond, can you just tell us when were these pieces made? When did you start working on this body?
Well, I started with the glass blowing in 2014. And in the first body of work, I was lucky. Leslie submitted the work to Corning, who was having a Glass Today show. And they accepted me as the outlier. Here's a crazy guy.
New glass now.
The new glass now.
Yes.
There you go. You
yes.
would know. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I got into that exhibition, and that was their first really physical exhibition in over 40 years. And so I was, I was proud. Hey, I cracked the glass world without going to your gallery too. No, because I have to say the Heller Gallery, I worked as a consultant for art collector, and he bought glass. And our first purchases were at the Heller Gallery on Madison Avenue. And Doug and his
You have to point where, I don't know where that goes.
well, he's hiding it, yeah. But Doug and his brother were always so sweet, so generous, so informed, and so ahead of the curve, And really, it was a treat. Alan eventually didn't pursue glass, he stayed with ceramics. But, he bought a lot of nice Harvey Littleton pieces, actually. It was really beautiful.
So, Sally Silberberg is a dear friend and one of my neighbors, and this body of work was one that I adored because I worked in colored clays, and she did something that nobody else had ever done, and I don't think ever has done. So,
no one else is crazy enough to take translucent porcelain when this material is essentially the same as that material. And while I was working in translucent porcelain and the pieces became thinner and thinner, one of the things I enjoyed most was trimming the pieces after they became leather hard. The material is almost like stone, a magical, soft, light stone. And I wondered if I could fire this as a block, not just as a very, very thin vessel. So the first piece is about this big. I started about 1985, maybe 84, and within a couple of years, they just started taking a life of their own. And the whole premise of it is that the piece is constructed in slivers, and that allows these solid pieces are fired that wherever the heat is coming through the piece, and they're fired to a ceramic porcelain temperature of over 2,000 degrees, that the gas will just kind of creep out of the slivers and not explode them. And they became more and more exciting because there was like this structure I was creating. And I live in Plainfield, Massachusetts, which is about maybe 25 miles from here, surrounded by glacial rocks. And the work is pressing the rocks that I'm looking at all the time. And I really feel like I'm making rocks. And a couple of years ago, I was at the LA County Museum, a wonderful show of Chinese scholar rocks. And there was this one piece that was just magnificent. And the base was echoing the piece. Instead of just being a little round thing, square, it was taking the contours of the piece. I thought, this is the missing link of these pieces. So Leslie connected me with Bill Kelly, who is here, and Bill created these bases for me, and just to give them a sense of place in this whole thing. And then in 1988, 89, I stopped doing it. We moved back to New York City, and I started painting, and this work has been sitting in my basement for almost 40 years. And Leslie has convinced me that its time has come.
Good. Well, I'm so glad you allowed me to convince you
to
bring the work out.
It was a hard sell, I have to tell you.
Because it's beautiful and it fits so perfectly between the generations of artists who, might have gone to school to try to do this, whereas these younger, the original melters, as we've been calling them, are just, just kind of following their nose through, different techniques. So.
I mean, my work has always followed my nose, and right now I'm working with colored pencil, and I'm doing transfer drawings where there are mirror drawings where the original drawing is on paper, and then it's traced, and the mirror is then transferred on top of it. And it's completely unknown what actually happens. It's sort of magical. It's like opening a pill. It's like, I set it up, and as Ferrin says, you don't really know, and it just kind of creates itself. So I'm still working, but not in ceramics.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you. Our final speaker is going to be Tom Patti, and I asked Doug Heller, who really is the person who should introduce him, to do so.
Hello, everybody, and what a pleasure it is to be here. My compliments to Leslie and to Katya for putting together an extremely interesting exhibition, which I hope many of you have the opportunity to see not only here, but in New York, in our gallery. It's very interesting for me to be here. Raymond mentioned the good old days. There are two artists in this room that I've known since the early 1970s, Sidney Cash and Tom Patti, who have opened up the world for me. And one of the most important things art does is to let us see the world in a new and different way. And both Sidney and Tom are geniuses at that. And I still remember when Tom first came into our tiny little place on Madison Avenue with a brown paper bag in his hand. I thought he was delivering lunch to somebody and he was lost. And he came in and he said, "I'd like to show you something." And he took out an object not quite as refined as that, but as interesting as the compacted pieces. And it was something that I, who was somebody who knew a great deal about glass and glass history, had never seen anything like before. Tom found an entirely new approach to a multi-thousand-year-old field. You know, he new way of thinking, new way of working, and walking with Tom was always a sense of discovery, because he would expound on everything, but it wasn't just so much blah, blah, blah. It was like, oh, I never thought about it that way. And Sidney has that gift also. You know, so it's really, I think, a privilege to know people like this and to be involved in an exhibition like this. So I'll let Tom present his work.
Nice to see everyone here. Katya, Leslie, thank you for the opportunity to exhibit here. It's a wonderful show. I'm going to check everything out and enjoy it with everyone else. We'll talk about my work. I know I have 5 minutes, right? But I'd like to talk about this work that people are less familiar with.
We started by asking people to say what year, so that people can orient themselves in some point during, what year that's.
This is the late 60s, early 70s.
Okay, that's, yeah.
Now, to understand this shape, I think of all my work as evolutionary, that one work leads to the next work, to the next work, and so on. And that's why I keep my work around for as long as I can, sometimes many years. I've been working on a series now for 20 years, and I'm just starting to edit it, decide what I want to keep, what I want to discard. So time is not an issue. The issue is to find the work that has a greater meaning to what my pursuit is. And I sort of discover it, what that pursuit is, as I work along through the work. Initially, imagine I grew up in the 60s, like those people that can relate to the 60s. It was a great time of revolution in the country. You know, Vietnam War was going on, our president had been assassinated. It was a dynamic time. My wife and I, Marilyn, who helps me along with everything you see, we met at Pratt Institute. Black Panthers were at the gate. It was a crazy, wild time. So it was important that we find something in life that's meaningful, because everything seemed to be in crisis. And so my undergraduate and graduate work and work beyond that went into shelters for less developed countries, trying to find habitats for human survival in environments that were often difficult to live in. And so I developed a system to make thin shell structures using inflatable systems. If you put air in a thin membrane system, whether it's a fabric, a balloon, and so on, air expands symmetrically. so it wants to make it round. So if you want to find out the infinite form vocabulary to build a shape that has some meaning to the application it's going to have, in this case housing, you want to be able to have a flat surface, a compound surface, convex, or an infinite array or combinations of those surfaces. So that's what I pursued looking at materials. So I explored all kinds. I used air to inflate these materials, to lift the load, whether it was weight, the weight of the material itself, or the material that rigidized that structure, if it was a flexible one. So when I left New York and moved to the Berkshires where I was born in Pittsfield, and I built a studio just outside of Pittsfield out of found materials that I was beginning to work at while I was still in school. I built equipment that could further those ideas I was working with. And I was starting to build things large scale, quarter scale, the size of this room, in the fields, because there was a lot of area here that wasn't available in the city. So the Berkshires was an optimum environment to work in at the time. Eventually, I ran out of resources, and the work got smaller and smaller and smaller, but my energy didn't, my ideas did not. So what happened was I started reducing it in scale. Instead of trying to build something over months, I worked on it. I could produce things in days or hours, many of them, and get the information back quickly if I reduce the scale of things. So this is an object that speaks of that period of time. A lot of the inflatable structures have some kind of a structural assist to support them in some way, either in the initial stages of development that eventually would be removed in a terminal form, or it was actually a part of the form in some way. So I was always trying to figure out the form and the structure, how to maintain the two. And so what you see in something like this is being able to keep the structure of the form, the rigid component, with the inflatable surfaces of it. These are two pieces of glass. It's programmed. I use the word program. This is like pre-computer stuff, but it was about putting information on a plane, a flat plane, two-dimensional surface, and then manipulating that plane into a three-dimensional form. But I would program it. I'd manipulate it with simply the introduction of air pressure to create this shape. If I wanted to change this curve, I'd move this shape over. If I wanted to, that's why this makes this linear long as a plane. But what you see here is you see the structure, the form, all integrated as one. It's called architectonic, where the form and structure exist as one form. So what I would do is I'd make things like this, and I would just take a scale down a human being and put them in here. So this would be a big building, right? Or a big structure, so you can see a figure underneath here. So I imagined them being enormous in scale, but that they were physically this size. So I would record them this way, I'd photograph them, and then I'd manipulate the photographs with figures, and make models with them, and so on. And I would document it. Everything was in notebooks and file cabinets, and I kept the documentation. I would often discard the work and keep the documents. So I have file cabinets and notepads with all this information, which is too bizarre to go into in 5 minutes. Is my 5 minutes up? So it's the interesting thing is from here to here, this object to this object. There's a lot of work between those two, and a lot of information that was gained from this process that went into this. Eventually, I wanted to sort of work with transparent materials. These forms became transparent, and I would paint them, color them, and I would use so I could have them both opaque, where you couldn't see in for privacy, and clear, where you could see into them. I imagined myself on the interior looking out of the forms. What this form does, it allows you to be on the outside. You start to be an individual, the artist maker, looking into the form. What I'm doing now is I'm on the outside. Let me see, let me go back. I did an airport in California where I did all the surround of the airport. So when you get out of the train, you're like now in the work. So for me, that's a culmination that started from things like this, where the figure is in a certain position relative to the work, the viewer to the work, and now you're in the work. These are all found glasses, all found materials. Didn't have the resources to make glass. It was very expensive. Schools were glass blowing, studio glass movement originated in the university level. There were a number of people, like Sydney, I think, and myself, just a handful around the country, that had, they were not formally educated with glass working. And so experiences like this were not impossible. They weren't programmed in a way to preconceived methods of working. So I didn't have glass furnace and that, but I was able to take sheets of glass and form them certain ways. And this is the result of that work. It wasn't, you know, the material wasn't the essence for me. It was really how it could be translated into a concept, an idea that I was thinking about. And then they're self-generating. The wonderful thing is if I could put things like this, and there were many that came before this in glass, but this is sort of the terminal end of that series of work. I kept maybe 4 or 5 of them. That's it. I made probably hundreds of them. But I only needed to keep the ones at that time that were fully realized and that completed that thought. These are all salvaged materials. This glass came off the side of a building. There's a note on it. The cleaners on Tyler Street, the side of the building had glass. There was 2 types of glass that imitate stone that were created. And once I recognized that was glass, and I knew the guy in there, and there was one broken, I managed to get pieces of glass from him, and I started working with that. But I would go and salvage in the dumpsters of glass shops all around Pittsfield and wherever, and it's probably not 5 cents worth of glass in that object right here. But it's the only value is what you make of it, that glass.